Abandoned on a distant world. The winds of Averis 3 howled across its barren landscape, whipping up red dust and sand that danced like angry spirits. The planet was a forsaken graveyard of forgotten civilizations, its atmosphere thick with toxic clouds that choked life from the surface. The sky was forever scared by the black streaks of distant battles, and the land beneath it was nothing but jagged rocks and ash. No life existed here, or so it seemed. But in the midst of this barren world, a single, fragile cry echoed. A small child, no older than a toddler, lay abandoned on the dusty surface. His skin was pale, his hair matted and dirty from the cruel journey across space. The cry of the child, so small and desperate, could have easily been ignored by the harsh winds, yet it reached the ears of those who walked on Averis 3. He was alone. No one knew how he had arrived. Perhaps a rogue ship, an accident, or something more sinister. But for reasons unknown, this fragile human child was cast aside, left to die in the desolation. The Zyxorians, an advanced species of ruthless conquerors, stumbled upon him by sheer chance. They had been on the hunt for valuable resources in the sector when their scouts detected the child's presence. The first instinct of the Zyxorians was to dismiss him. A human, one of the species they had long deemed primitive and inferior. A worthless being, incapable of serving their needs. But something about the child intrigued them. Perhaps it was the sheer audacity of a human surviving in such a hostile environment. Perhaps it was the deep, instinctive pull they felt toward him, something that defied their cold logic. Whatever the reason, they took him in. The Zyxorians had no place for weakness, no place for pity, and certainly no place for a helpless human child. Yet, for reasons unknown even to themselves, they kept him. They brought him aboard their ship, a hulking vessel of sleek black armor, pulsating with cold energy. As the child was cared for, their scientists immediately began to study him. They were fascinated by his physiology, how such a fragile creature could exist, let alone survive on a planet like Averis 3. Kael, they named him, a name forged from the harsh syllables of the Zyxorian tongue. He was their prize, their pet project. They could break him, mold him, and use him for their gain. His humanity was not something to be embraced, but to be suppressed, buried deep under layers of Zyxorian influence. From the moment they decided to raise him, Kael's life ceased to be his own. His training began immediately. There were no moments of childhood joy, no stories of a mother's love or a father's guidance. There was only the weight of Zyxorian philosophy, the unyielding rules of a species that had mastered warfare, destruction, and control. His earliest memories were not of Earth but of endless drills, harsh commands, and cold mechanical routines. His body was transformed through Zyxorian medical procedures, enhanced to survive and thrive in their harsh world. His bones were reinforced with metallic alloys, his muscles hardened through genetic manipulation, and his mind sharpened by advanced cybernetic implants that allowed him to process information with inhuman speed. He was no longer a human child. He was a weapon. The Zyxorians made sure of it. The child who had cried alone on Averis 3 was now part of a vast empire, his every moment dictated by their will. His training was relentless. Hand-to-hand combat, tactical strategy, and the cold art of war. He was taught to fight, to lead, and above all, to obey. Earth, the planet from which he had come, was nothing more than a distant memory. He was told it was a world of chaos, an uncivilized place of primitive beings who had no place in the galaxy. In the Zyxorian order, Earth was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the universe: weakness, disorder, and chaos. Kael was taught to despise it, to fear its people. But deep inside, hidden beneath layers of alien conditioning, there remained a sliver of something else, something that could not be erased. There were fragments of memories that Kael could not fully grasp. Faint images that fluttered like ghosts in his mind, small flashes of a world he had never truly known. He would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat, his heart racing for no reason. In the silence of his quarters, he would hear a faint sound, soft, melodic laughter, like the sound of children playing in the distance. He would smell something faint in the air, something he could never quite place. Perhaps flowers or the warmth of a sunny day. The kind of day that didn't exist in the eternal darkness of Averis 3. He would try to focus on these fragments, but they slipped away as quickly as they came. Focus, Kael, his instructors would snap at him, their voices cold and demanding. The Empire is everything. You are Zyxorian. You are superior. They drilled it into him, again and again, until he believed it without question. But the memories lingered, quiet and unyielding. They were like a distant echo, a reminder of something Kael had once been, but could no longer remember. Earth was just a word now, a concept, a far-off planet that had no meaning in his life. He was Zyxorian. He had no need for Earth. Still, despite all the years of training, despite the alterations to his body and mind, something inside Kael began to stir. Every now and then, a feeling would wash over him, a sensation he could not define. It was as if something inside him was trying to wake up. It was fleeting, but it was there, a whisper of something ancient, something human. The Zyxorians, ever vigilant, would not allow such weakness to fester. They saw potential in Kael, but they also saw a danger. They knew better than anyone the cost of letting humanity's influence linger. If Kael's humanity was not completely erased, he could become a liability. And so they pushed him harder. They told him he was a weapon. He was an extension of the Zyxorian will. Earth was nothing. The universe was theirs to control. But still, those strange, unfamiliar memories lingered, clawing at the edges of his mind. And deep down, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that Earth, whatever it was waiting for him. The mission of destruction. Kael stood at the helm of the Zyxorian flagship, staring into the void of space. The stars stretched before him like a blanket of endless possibilities, but he saw them differently than he once had. Each one now felt like a far-off battleground, a mark on the map to conquer. It was an unbroken sea of victory and control, a canvas to be painted with the blood of enemies. He had known this existence for as long as he could remember. A sleek, obsidian vessel, the Vazithar, was his command. Its hull gleamed with dark, deadly efficiency, a ship built for war. Kael's fingers drummed lightly against the metal console in front of him, though his thoughts were elsewhere. The Zyxorians, his people, had made him a commander, a tactical genius in their great conquest. His mind was sharper than the finest blade, honed through years of training. He had spent his life mastering the art of warfare, dissecting enemies like an insect under a magnifying glass, and commanding forces with ruthless precision. Today, however, the mission was different. Today, Kael was not leading a raid on a neighboring empire or quelling a rebellion on a distant world. No, today was special. Today, the Zyxorians had set their sights on Earth. Earth. The name still held no clear meaning to Kael. He had been told stories, vague tales whispered by his instructors during long nights of training. A primitive world, they said. A planet that was not worthy of a second glance. Its inhabitants, weak and inferior. A backwater of the galaxy. The Zyxorians had long viewed Earth as a forgotten relic, best left to rot in the corner of the universe. But the Galactic Council had changed their minds. Earth's threat had grown too great. The Council had provided Kael with a single objective: eliminate Earth, destroy it, erase it from existence, and they had given him the most devastating weapon in their arsenal to do it: the Whale-Apart bomb. It was a device unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, a weapon capable of manipulating time itself, freezing the present, unraveling the past, and potentially rewriting history. No one, not even the Zyxorians, understood the full scope of its potential. Kael stood in the command room, watching as the Whale-Apart bomb was carefully loaded into the ship's core. The device was an orb of pulsating energy, its surface alive with crackling light, yet it was cold to the touch, an empty promise of power. He had seen it before, in the hands of Zyxorian scientists, and had heard the rumors of its destructive capabilities, how it could rip entire civilizations apart, how it could unmake reality itself. It was the perfect tool for a species bent on conquest, a perfect answer to the question of how to obliterate Earth. "Commander Kael," the voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Zora, his tactical officer, her voice cold and efficient. She stood rigid at her post, her expression unreadable. "We're entering the final sector. Earth is ahead." Kael's gaze flicked to the view screen. The blue planet loomed large in the distance, its swirling oceans and vibrant landmasses glaringly out of place in the cold, lifeless void of space. Earth appeared, in that moment, so full of life, so full of potential, that Kael almost felt the pull of it. But that feeling was fleeting. He knew his mission. He was Zyxorian. There was no room for hesitation, no place for weakness. Earth had to be destroyed. It was the order of the Council. It was the right thing to do. Still, as he watched Earth grow larger on the screen, strange emotions stirred within him. There were flashes, images of green fields, towering trees, and open skies, strange and beautiful things that didn't belong in the world of war he had come to know. The sensation was like a flicker of light in the dark. His breath caught in his chest for just a second, and before he could process it, the feeling was gone. Not again, he thought, shaking his head, trying to banish the unsettling sensation. He focused on the mission, on the task at hand. His orders were clear. There could be no deviation. "Deploy the bomb," Kael ordered, his voice steady, betraying none of the confusion he felt stirring inside. But as the whale-apart bomb was readied, something inside Kael shifted, something deep, buried in the recesses of his mind. The truth was beginning to crack through his Zyxorian training. A flicker of doubt, a hesitation that had no place in a warrior's heart. The engineers at the station didn't seem to notice. They were accustomed to the cold, emotionless nature of their tasks. They carried out their duties, unaware of the growing storm within their commander. As Kael surveyed the preparations, he heard a sound, soft and foreign. The crackling hum of the ship's energy core seemed to pulse in rhythm with something else, something almost human. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but it came again. A sound, a melody, faint and distant, but it stirred something in him. A memory. No, more than a memory. A feeling. The sound of voices, laughter. It was a feeling he couldn't explain. Home. But before he could grasp the thought fully, his mind was flooded with more images, this time not from Earth, but of the Zyxorians. Cold, mechanical, efficient. He saw himself as they saw him, a weapon, an instrument of power, a harbinger of destruction. He had been raised for this very moment. And yet, why? "Commander Kael," Zora said again, snapping him from his reverie. Her voice was sharp, almost impatient now. "We are in range." Kael nodded, returning to his post. Earth was moments away. It felt surreal, like standing at the edge of a precipice, about to leap into the unknown. His entire existence, all he had known and been trained to believe, was built for this moment. But as his finger hovered over the activation command, a new question arose in his mind. Is this truly the right choice? It was a question he had never asked himself before, and it chilled him to the bone. The awakening. The first drop of water was a revelation. It came without warning. A mere slip of liquid that landed on Kael's hand as he knelt near the edge of a small stream, the glint of the Earth's sun reflected in its rippling surface. He didn't expect it to feel so alive, so real. His fingers curled around the cool substance, almost instinctively, as if his body knew something his mind couldn't comprehend. The sensation sent a jolt through his veins, awakening something deep within him. For the first time, Kael wasn't a weapon. He wasn't a Zyxorian conqueror. He wasn't anyone. He was simply a being, a life, touching something ancient. something pure. The moment his hand met the water, his mind fractured. It was as if a door had been kicked open, one he hadn't even known was there, and memories, strange and vivid, came rushing through him like a storm. He saw the green of Earth's vast fields, the bright blue sky stretching endlessly above. He saw faces, faces he couldn't name, his mother, his father, people he'd never known. His heart beat faster, but not with fear. No, it was something more. Longing. An emotion he'd never been trained to understand. It was too much, too fast. He jerked his hand back, instinctively wiping it against the fabric of his uniform, as if erasing the sensation. But the damage was done. A single drop of water had done what years of Zyxorian indoctrination couldn't. It had started something, an awakening. His body, his mind, had begun to unravel, slowly and quietly. The first flash of memory was gone in an instant, replaced by a powerful pulse of emotion. Confusion. Love. Love for the planet. Love for its people. Love for something he didn't yet understand. Kael staggered back, his breath shallow, as his vision blurred. The air around him seemed thicker now, like it was pressing in on him. He tried to steady himself, gripping the ground beneath him. The water, he had touched it. And in that single touch, the floodgates had opened. The Zyxorians had never spoken of Earth in such glowing terms. Earth was primitive. Earth was weak. Its people were nothing more than insects beneath the Zyxorian boot. But that was a lie, wasn't it? Impossible, he muttered under his breath, trying to choke back the wave of emotions that surged inside him. He couldn't let himself be swayed. He was Zyxorian. His purpose was clear. Earth was a threat. Earth must be destroyed. And yet, a soft voice interrupted his spiraling thoughts, cutting through the haze. It was the voice of one of his officers, Zora. Her presence was always sharp, always to the point. But today it felt different, as if she could sense something was wrong. "Commander Kael, we're ready to deploy the bomb. The Council has given us their final orders." Her words were firm, but her gaze flicked to him with a strange intensity. Was she watching him? Kael nodded, his throat tight. "Proceed." Zora didn't question him, but she lingered for a moment longer than usual. Kael could feel the weight of her stare, a quiet probe. Her suspicion was something he had never felt before. She had always been loyal. But now, there was something different, something unsettled. The bomb was ready. Earth was waiting. His mission was still the same. But Kael couldn't shake the feeling. The flood of memories, the bond he felt with the planet. It wasn't just water. It was the air, the trees, the land. It was everything about this world that had no place in his mind, no room in his Zyxorian conditioning. Earth wasn't a dying planet to be erased. It was alive. Alive in a way the Zyxorians could never be. Alive with something the Zyxorians had forgotten. As Kael stood there, staring down at the stream, a pulse of regret twisted through him, sharp and sudden. What am I doing? For the first time, the Zyxorians, their mission, their empire, felt foreign. The hatred they had taught him to carry, the cold logic that had molded him, seemed like a distant echo now. Humanity, that was what had changed him. The humanity he'd never known was now beating within him, louder than any military order or planetary conquest. "Commander Kael," Zora called again, her voice a cold reminder of the path he was supposed to walk. "Time is short. The Council demands it." He turned away from the stream, the cold hand of duty wrapping around his chest like a vice. The Whale-Apart bomb, the destruction, the mission. But for the first time, Kael realized something important. He wasn't sure he could go through with it anymore. The water had changed everything. The stream rushed on, oblivious to him, unaware of the battle waging inside his soul. Kael took a deep breath, standing tall once more. There was still time. There was still a choice. But which one was right? A commander's doubt. Kael had always believed he understood the world around him. His world, the Zyxorian world. He had been raised on discipline, logic, and the unyielding belief that their empire was the universe's rightful ruler. The Zyxorians were conquerors, warriors, and he was their finest creation. And yet, he walked through the crowded streets of a human city, blending in as best as he could with the locals. His uniform was hidden beneath a cloak, his alien physiology concealed under the guise of human clothing. He had never truly ventured into their cities before, at least not this intimately. Earth's human cities had always seemed like distant, chaotic ecosystems from his ship's high windows, buzzing masses of frantic life, nothing more than ants to be crushed beneath Zyxorian boots. But now, the buildings seemed to pulse with a heartbeat. The streets were filled with life, each person a flickering flame, burning with the light of their own stories. He had heard of human perseverance, their grit in the face of adversity, but he had never felt it, never experienced it firsthand until now. He watched a young man helping an elderly woman cross the street, his hand steady, guiding her through the bustling traffic. He observed children laughing, chasing one another around the cobbled paths, their faces bright with untainted joy. He felt the warmth of the sun on his skin, and the air, heavy with the scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery, was so earthy, so full of life. It all felt wrong. It felt right. A sense of deep conflict roiled inside him, like two opposing forces waging a war within his chest. The human spirit was a paradox. It was unbroken by struggle, yet so fragile in its need for connection. It thrived in the very adversity the Zyxorians sought to quash. How could a species this wild, this alive, be a threat to the order the Zyxorians had built? How could he, a child of that very order, now question the wisdom of his people? It was the sound of laughter that made the difference. He hadn't noticed it at first. The sound was distant, mingled with the noise of the street. But then it cut through the haze in his mind, sharp and sudden, a burst of pure, unrestrained joy. It was a girl, a human child, no older than 6 or 7, laughing as she swung on the playground swing, her small legs kicking out with the wind. Her laughter, so pure and unhindered, rang in his ears, and it pierced something in him. A buried memory, or something more. The laughter echoed in his mind, mixing with something else, something old. It was his own laughter, a distant echo from a past he didn't even remember. A voice, faint and blurred, calling to him. Was that a memory of his own childhood? Or had the laughter become a bridge, connecting him to something he had been too blind to see? The girl's swing slowed as she spotted him, her gaze locking with his. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation, only curiosity, like she was meeting a stranger who had just appeared out of nowhere. She tilted her head, sensing something in him that others didn't. Perhaps it was the subtle change in his posture, the way his hand gripped the rail, the slight unease in his expression. "Who are you?" she asked simply, her voice soft and unguarded. Kael froze. The words hit him like a hammer. "Who are you?" The question rang louder than any battle cry. He had always known his name, Kael, the name given to him by the Zyxorians, the name that carried the weight of war and conquest. But here, on Earth, it seemed meaningless. Who was he really? Was he a child of the Zyxorian Empire, a tool of destruction, or something more? Something that had been hidden for so long, buried under layers of programming, of indoctrination. I'm no one," he found himself muttering, his voice hushed. "Just someone passing through." The girl didn't seem satisfied with his answer. She swung higher, her tiny feet catching the air with ease, and she asked again, more forcefully this time. "No, who are you really?" Her persistence unnerved him, but it also fascinated him. What made her so sure that there was something behind his eyes? Something more than the uniform he wore, more than the mission he was sent on. What did she see in him? He began. The words tangled in his throat. I'm Kael. Kael, she repeated thoughtfully, as though testing the name on her tongue. Kael sounds like someone who should be helping, not hurting. You look like you've seen a lot, but your eyes don't belong here. Her words hung in the air long after she had returned to her swing, her gaze drifting away as if she had forgotten the conversation altogether. But Kael couldn't forget. He stood there for a long while, the chaos of the city swirling around him, the sounds of life pressing in like a storm. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a conqueror. The Whalapard bomb countdown. The countdown had begun. Kael stood at the center of the Zyxorian warship, his fingers hovering over the control panel, the cold, unyielding surface of it a stark contrast to the turbulence in his chest. The Whalapard bomb was locked and loaded, ready to unleash its devastating power. The alien engineers, those who had worked tirelessly to ensure its flawless function, had done their part. Now it was up to him. He glanced over the blueprints once more. The intricate calculations burned into his mind. The bomb was designed to do more than just decimate Earth's cities, cripple its defenses, or annihilate its leadership. No, the Whalapard bomb was something far darker, more insidious. It could rewrite time itself, tinker with the very fabric of history. The Zyxorians had conceived it to be a final, irreversible blow to Earth's future, a weapon that would twist the timeline and erase humanity's potential for resistance. The Whalapard bomb was not simply about destruction. It was about control. And in the eyes of the Zyxorians, humanity's future was a threat they couldn't afford to ignore. Yet, as Kael's hand hovered over the activation sequence, he couldn't stop thinking about the girl, the child whose laughter still echoed in his mind. She had looked at him with such certainty, such raw truth in her gaze, as if she could see right through the walls he had built around himself. She had called him by name, but it was as if she had known something deeper, something Kael was only beginning to understand. Who was he really? What was he really doing? His finger trembled, and in that moment, the entire universe felt like it was holding its breath. Suddenly, the walls of the command center shimmered, as if the ship itself could sense the turmoil within its commander. A low hum vibrated through the deck, an uneasy warning that the Zyxorian fleet was closing in on Earth. The Council's orders echoed in his mind. Clear, demanding, unyielding. Time was running out. The fleet was nearing Earth's orbit, and the Council would tolerate no more delays. His second-in-command, a tall and calculating officer named Sylar, approached from behind. "Commander Kael," he said, his voice like gravel. "The time to act is now. We've waited long enough. The Council demands results." Kael stiffened, but he didn't turn. Instead, he focused on the screen before him, watching the silent countdown tick closer to zero. The weight of the Zyxorian fleet's power loomed above Earth, his fleet, his responsibility. The fate of two worlds now hung on his decision. "Yes," Kael whispered, more to himself than to Sylar. "The time to act is now." But was he really ready to do this? Was he ready to push the button and destroy everything? The last few days on Earth, his quiet moments among the humans, had shaken him to his core. He had seen their lives, their hopes, their dreams, and felt the spark of something he had never known before. He had felt the warmth of their sun, tasted their water, and heard the sound of their laughter. He had touched the essence of humanity, and for the first time in his life, he was torn between duty and something far more primal, something human. Sylar's cold gaze pierced him from behind. "Commander," he repeated, sharper now, his voice a reminder that the mission couldn't be postponed. "The Council expects results. If we hesitate now, we risk everything." The countdown continued, ticking louder in Kael's ears with each passing second. There was no time for doubt, no time for hesitation. He had to act. But as his finger brushed the final command to activate the Whalapard bomb, something inside him snapped. His mind flooded with images, flashes of the girl, of Earth's cities, of the sounds of human laughter. The weight of his decision was too heavy. He couldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. No. He slammed his hand down on the panel, but not to trigger the bomb's activation. Instead, he rerouted the bomb's energy, diverting it from Earth's core to the vacuum of space. The bomb's energy flared briefly, then dissipated harmlessly into the vast emptiness of the galaxy. A breathless silence filled the room. Kael stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as the decision he had just made took root. It wasn't just the bomb that he had defused. It was the very core of the empire he had sworn allegiance to. A single moment of rebellion, one act of mercy, had shattered the certainty of his entire existence. Sylar's voice broke the silence, cold and accusatory. "What have you done?" "I've made a choice," Kael replied, his voice calm, though it quivered with the raw power of his decision. "One that's long overdue." Outside the viewport, Earth loomed like a jewel in the vastness of space. For the first time, Kael saw it not as a target, but as something alive, something that deserved to exist. Sylar's fury was palpable, but Kael couldn't bring himself to care. He had chosen a path that no longer led to destruction, but to something uncertain, something he couldn't yet understand. He turned away from the console, his back straight, his resolve hardening with each passing moment. "Prepare for the fleet's arrival," he ordered, his voice firm. "But not for battle. We're going to do this another way." Sylar's confusion was written all over his face. You're going to negotiate with them." Kael nodded, turning his gaze back to the stars. "No, I'm going to show them what it means to be human." It was no longer a question of whether he would save Earth. It was a question of whether he could save himself. Defying the Galactic Council, the Zyxorian fleet loomed overhead, an armada of gleaming ships that outclassed anything the galaxy had ever seen. The starships stretched like a silver storm cloud, a military juggernaut designed to crush all opposition underfoot. It was an unmistakable symbol of the Empire's power, imposing, untouchable, unyielding. But Kael, standing in the command center of his flagship, no longer saw it that way. The shimmering fleet, once his pride, now seemed like a horde of automatons, blind to the fragile beauty they were about to destroy. The Council's orders had come through loud and clear. Earth must be eliminated. No hesitation, no mercy. He could almost hear their voices in his mind, the voices of the Council's high-ranking officials, their cold, metallic tones demanding obedience. "Finish the mission, Commander Kael. Do not falter." The weight of their expectations pressed down on him, suffocating, choking out every ounce of the humanity that was rapidly awakening inside him. The screens flickered to life in front of him, showing the advancing fleet. Earth, his Earth, spun beneath them, a small blue orb in the vastness of the void. He remembered the girl's face, the sound of her laughter, her unwavering belief that there was something better out there, something that didn't involve war, violence, or the destruction of life. That moment, that single encounter, had unraveled everything. Kael couldn't kill them. Not anymore. Not after what he had seen, what he had felt. And yet, his loyalty to the Zyxorians, his duty to his people, still pulled at him. He had been bred for this, trained for this, designed for this. "Commander Kael," Sylar's voice cut through his thoughts, like a jagged shard of ice. "We are within range of Earth's atmosphere. The Council is expecting your action. Do you need assistance activating the bomb?" Kael's gaze hardened. The words burned on his tongue, but he refused to speak them. Sylar had been with him since the beginning, his most trusted officer, his friend, in some ways. But there could be no more friendship in this moment. No more trust in the old ways. The Zyxorians would never understand what he was about to do. "No," Kael replied, his voice steady. "I have a different plan." Sylar's eyes narrowed, a look of skepticism crossing his face. "A different plan. The Council will not tolerate deviation. You know this." "I don't care," Kael said, his voice hardening, the words slipping from him like a revelation. "I've made my choice, Sylar. And it's not one that involves the destruction of Earth. There was a long pause as the weight of Kael's words sank in. Siler's face twisted in confusion, his eyes flashing with a mix of disbelief and anger. "You're betraying the mission," Siler hissed, stepping forward, his fists clenched. "You're betraying us." Kael turned, his expression unflinching. "The mission isn't what I thought it was, Siler. Earth isn't a threat. It's a possibility, a future that we've overlooked for too long." "Do you hear yourself?" Siler spat, his voice rising. "You've spent your life training for this, and now you're telling me we're saving them. They're nothing but animals, Kael. And you were trained to destroy them?" Kael cut him off, his voice soft but forceful. "No, we were trained to fear them, to believe they were beneath us. But I've seen their strength, their resilience, their humanity, and I can't go through with this. Not anymore." For a moment, Siler stood there, frozen. His mouth opened and closed as if he couldn't quite find the right words. Then, with a snarl of frustration, he spun on his heel and stormed out of the room, the heavy door sliding shut behind him with a hiss. Kael stood in silence, his mind racing. The Zyxorian fleet, his fleet, had already begun preparing for their descent into Earth's atmosphere. If Kael hesitated for even a moment longer, they would engage. And Kael wasn't sure what would happen next, what he would do. He took a deep breath, his mind clearing as the surge of emotion and indecision began to settle. He had made his choice. Now he had to make it count. The room flickered, the lights dimming briefly, and Kael's fingers danced across the control panel. A holographic map of Earth appeared before him, filled with glowing markers, indicators of targets, vital points for destruction. But Kael didn't focus on those. His eyes drifted to Earth's core, to the pulse of life beneath the surface. His hands moved swiftly, adjusting the coordinates, rerouting the weapon's energy. The Whalapard bomb, designed to obliterate Earth's very timeline, was now aimed in a different direction. Instead of targeting Earth, Kael would release the bomb's energy harmlessly into space, without detonating it on Earth, but instead sending its force into the nothingness of the cosmos. The Council wouldn't understand. The Zyxorians would never forgive him. But Earth would be safe. For now. "Commander," a voice crackled over the intercom. It was Siler again, his tone clipped with frustration. "The fleet is prepared to engage. What are your orders?" Kael's finger hovered over the final button, his heart pounding, his breath shallow. There was no going back now. The galaxy was about to change. And so was he. "Stand down," Kael ordered, his voice unwavering. "We're not attacking Earth." The ship trembled slightly, as if the very hull of it recoiled in disbelief. Outside, the fleet hovered, waiting for a command that would never come. The finality of his words echoed through the ship like a thunderclap. Kael had broken free of the chains that had bound him to the Zyxorians. No longer their puppet, no longer their weapon. He had chosen something else, something human, the aftermath of mercy. The air on the Zyxorian homeworld was heavy with an unnatural stillness, as if the entire planet had held its breath in anticipation. In the grand halls of the Council's citadel, the aftermath of Kael's betrayal rippled through the Empire like a shockwave. Every chamber, every hall, seemed to vibrate with tension, as if the very fabric of Zyxorian society had begun to unravel. Kael stood before the Council, a once proud assembly of hardened leaders who had ruled with an iron grip for centuries. Now their faces were masked with disbelief, their cold eyes flickering with confusion and fear. He had rejected their mission, their ideology, their warlike empire. In a single moment, he had shattered the very foundation of everything they believed in. "You are a traitor," the Supreme General, Inarch, hissed from his elevated seat, his voice low and venomous. His large, obsidian eyes narrowed as he glared down at Kael. "Your mercy has condemned us all. You defied the will of the Empire, and for that, you will answer." Kael stood unmoving, his gaze unwavering. He could feel the weight of their condemnation, the gravity of their judgment pressing against him. But the sting of their words had no power over him now. "They don't understand," Kael whispered, his voice hoarse, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "They will never understand." Inarch's lips curled into a snarl, his massive form rising from his seat. "You speak of mercy like it is a gift. It is weakness, a flaw. The Zyxorian way has always been one of strength, of domination. You've corrupted your mind with these human ideals." But Kael was no longer the same soldier who had once obeyed these orders without question. The human part of him, what remained of it, was stronger now, sharper than ever. His memories of Earth, the girl with the dreams of stars, the softness of rain, the tenderness of a laugh, these fragments of his past were not mere distractions. They were his strength. "They would never have understood," Kael said quietly, "not unless they saw what I saw. What we did, it was not weakness, it was strength. It was the strength to see beyond the cold, calculated logic of war and understand the value of life." The silence in the room was deafening. The council members shifted uneasily in their seats, exchanging looks that spoke volumes. Kael could see the cracks beginning to form in their once unshakable facade. They were still powerful, still capable of devastation, but in that moment, they seemed fragile, more human, perhaps, than they had ever realized. Kael's defiance, his mercy, had shattered something deep within them, something they had never known could be broken. Their rigidity, their certainty, their absolute belief in the Zyxorian way. Outside the citadel, beyond the mountains and the great oceans that stretched across their world, the Zyxorian fleet stood still. The ships that had once been instruments of terror, of calculated conquest, were now in disarray. Their commanders had returned from Earth, their minds fractured, their spirits crumbling under the weight of a concept they could neither understand nor accept: mercy. The survivors, the warriors who had fought under Kael's command, had been stripped of their rank and cast aside. They were placed in isolation, away from the rest of the Zyxorian population, where their minds could be studied and dissected. The Zyxorian scientists, some of them eager, some of them horrified, pored over them, analyzing their every thought, their every tremor, trying to understand what had happened to them. But there were no answers. The warriors who had been exposed to human compassion, who had witnessed Kael's act of mercy, were broken. Their minds, programmed for war, had been unable to process what they had been shown. They had been conditioned to expect violence, destruction, domination, not the profound, unsettling power of kindness. As days turned to weeks, and weeks into months, the once proud soldiers of the Zyxorian fleet grew weaker. They were shadows of their former selves, haunted by the mercy they could neither comprehend nor accept. Their actions, once precise, calculated, and deadly, had become erratic. They trembled at the thought of empathy, of compassion, as if it were a disease. In the end, they were nothing more than broken echoes of the empire that had created them. And Kael, he was cast into exile, stripped of his title, his rank, and his status. The Zyxorian Council had no use for a traitor, especially one who had dared to challenge the most sacred tenets of their existence. Yet Kael did not feel the sting of their judgment. His heart was no longer bound by the Zyxorian ideals. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But as he wandered through the desolate corridors of his exile, Kael felt no regret. For the first time in his life, he felt free. The stars above him whispered of a future yet unwritten. Earth, the world he had been taught to hate, to destroy, was no longer an enemy. It was a place of hope, a place of potential, and perhaps, one day, a place where he could finally belong. As the Zyxorian Empire slowly disintegrated from within, unable to recover from the damage Kael had wrought, a new chapter began to take shape, not just for him, but for the universe itself. A chapter where mercy, not violence, would be the guiding force. A chapter where humanity's strength would light the way. And for the first time in his life, Kael allowed himself to smile. not in triumph, not in victory, but in quiet, humble hope. The future was his to shape, and this time, the galaxy would listen.